Hey everyone, and welcome back to the It's Noble podcast. I'm your host, Noah Bradon, and today we're continuing our series of in depth interviews about topics at the intersection of truth, beauty, and Catholicism, with a discussion about Pope Benedict XVI. So, for tonight's episode, I'm happy to introduce my guest for today, who is Dom Dalmaso of the Logos Project, and I'll be sure to link that below. Dom has spent considerable time studying Pope Benedict, also commonly known by his former last name, Ratzinger, and I'm really looking forward to learning from him. So throughout tonight's episode, if you have any questions for Dom or myself, please be sure to drop them in the comments below, and we'll be sure to leave time to address them toward the end. So, Dom, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Noah. I really appreciate the invite.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been following your work with interest for quite a while now, so I'm excited to be able to learn directly
Thank
and
you.
pick your brain. Yeah, no, my pleasure. I think that's one of the reasons that I selfishly love these interviews so much, is because it's an opportunity for me to actually learn about things that I'm interested in, right? So
Yeah.
lest anyone think that I'm being entirely altruistic in my production of these things, right? It's also just I love learning, so it's really exciting. So, to kick us off, would you mind introducing yourself and just tell us a little bit about your work for anyone who is unfamiliar with you?
Yeah, my name's Dom. I run the YouTube channel. It's also a podcast called the Logos Project. And I'm currently, I just graduated from Holy Apostles College and Seminary with a bachelor's in philosophy and theology. And now I'm studying theology at the as a graduate student. I'm not officially a kind of Benedict scholar at all, but I am very interested in him. So I read him quite a bit. And so I do a lot of content on my YouTube channel on his theology and related issues, apologetics or scripture, church politics. I try to do that less now, but stuff like that. So
No, that's wonderful. What initially drew you to him? What sparked the fascination in the first place?
yeah, well, so I grew up in the Society of St. Pius X, and in 2007 was kind of officially when we, as a family, transitioned to the Fraternity of St. Peter. But it's also in 2007 that Pope Benedict's Summorum Pontificum came out, and he lifted the excommunications of the four bishops. And so he's always been a very important character in, the circumstances of my faith, if that makes sense,
Mm.
being connected to the society and then even to the fraternity. But also, I had the opportunity um, of being able to spend several visits at the Abbey of Our Lady of Fontainebleau in France, and they were connected with him because he had a liturgical seminar at Fontainebleau, and so when he became pope, they were very pleased. And I was visiting there when he, in the first year of his pontificate, and the monks kept talking to me about him, saying how great of a pope we have. And so that was kind of the beginning of my interest being piqued on, well, who is this pope? And he seems to have this knack for reconciling people. And so that's when I first heard about him. But later on, when I started, encountering Protestant friends, theology and faith and apologetics became much more, important and an area of interest. And but also even kind of within the church, certain disputes or positions, he always seemed to have a very helpful response to almost any question I had when
Mm.
I turned to him. And I turned to him precisely because I had heard of him. I had heard other people talk of him in a very praising way, and so I just said, you know what, all these different questions about the modern world's relationship to the church, the kind of what he calls the eclipse of God in our culture, Protestant Catholic relations, Anglicans, Orthodox. He addresses everything, and so I would always be able to turn to him for an answer. And I found that his answers were always extremely helpful. So that's really how I discovered him. Is I just, he kept answering my questions and providing me with satisfying answers. And so that's when I first discovered him, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does, and I think that's a wonderful organic way of discovering him in a sense, right? And getting to know him
Hmm.
more deeply through your studies. That's really interesting. And indeed, he was a prolific writer. I think that's one of the wonderful things about him. And
Hmm.
I think, at least from my somewhat more cursory understanding of his work, he does really seem to address almost all of the major modern issues that are plaguing the church at this time, which I think is a really fascinating thing, even for us in this specific day, not just for him at his time. Can you comment a little bit on that? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is why he'll be a doctor of the church, because a doctor of the church is declared so because they've contributed something positive in the life of the church that has helped the church move forward. And I think anybody who studies theology or who is, looking at culture knows that we are at a juncture, right? Like Christendom is gone. We're in a post-Christian world. We're not just in a modern world, but we're in a postmodern world. Now we're thinking we're in a post-postmodern world. So what comes next? There's a juncture here. The old has come to an end, and the new is looming. And what do we do? Who do we turn to? Who can guide us? Who can give us a vision that's coherent, helpful, and that gives us a kind of stability, certain foundations, which is why he was so good in fundamental theology, in addressing those foundations of theology. And in him, I discovered that his voice provides you with a stability, a personal stability, a stability that can help you move forward within that juncture. Because a lot of people get, and I understand this, happens to all of us, but we get kind of worn down because there's a kind of loss of meaning in the culture, and we don't really know what to do, and everything is in crisis. What we believe, we kind of have this existential crisis, and he seems to really be aware of that and to speak to it in a way that actually helps.
Mhm.
And so I'm on a tangent. I'm sorry, but yeah, basically, he really is. If you're wondering about what in the world is happening in my life, in the life of the church, and in the life of humanity, because there's clearly a big crisis of culture and of history. Well, he really is the guy I think to read if that's the case. If you feel that way,
I don't think
so
that's a tangent at all, to be honest with you, because one of the sub questions that I don't even need to really answer or don't need to ask anymore because we addressed it, I think, was just what do you admire most about him? And I think that's in exactly what we've been talking about in that contribution.
yeah.
But is there anything else that you would, like to say before we dive into his biography, just about what you kind of overall admire about him? And then I do actually maybe before I'll let you think about that, I have one just interesting side comment, which I'm curious to maybe dig into a little bit later. But in my reading of him, I've also been surprised because I think he's often characterized as sort of one particular way and almost an extremist and almost relegated to a particular corner. And the more I read him, the more I discover this depth and this nuance and this gentleness, or at least this balance in between intellectual and theological rigor and true pastoral concern. And I think that's something that's often missing from the pictures and the portraits that we see of him, even within Catholic news. I don't know. It's been something that's been interesting
Oh
to
my
me, at
goodness.
least when I read him. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you just there's so many things to say there. I mean, yes, he's been in the media. His image has been murdered, unfortunately, and the Ratzinger or the Benedict of the media is not the real one. And I think we all, and even on the conservative side, we all have an image of him that begins to shatter the more you read him and the more you get to know him.
Mhm.
And whether you're a progressive or whether you're a traditionalist, the more you read him, you start to realize I cannot put this man in any kind of cultural category that I've come up with. And so he has this incredible ability to create communion, to create dialogue, to create openness and peace, and yet he also in his thought can anger, I would say, the liberal as much as the conservative. Not anger is probably the wrong word, but he can people won't they'll find him challenging because he's not just going to agree with the way you think. He's going to challenge you. There's something about the way he thinks and the way he the trajectory of his thought that transcends all of these on the ground factions and battles. There's really a sense that he does see something that goes way beyond all of that, and he's basically like mediating he wrote a lot about the nature of the priesthood, and
Mm.
for him, at the heart of the priesthood is this self effacement, this losing of one's I. This the self is lost, so that we can become completely transparent, like a window through which God can come through to the people. And so the moment a priest, the moment his ego and his I gets involved, then the gospel gets cloudy, and his the message of our Lord gets kind of tampered with. And so he was all about kind of getting out of the way and letting the tradition and letting the genius of all of these great thinkers come through him in a way where he would synthesize it for you and just hand it to you. So he's very humble and self-effacing. But I already forgot the original question.
Oh, don't
But
worry.
uh,
That was perfect. I mean, I think we were just talking about, what we admire about him, and then we were talking about just
yeah,
mischaracterizations of him, right? How he's painted. I think he's just
yes,
painted
yeah,
into too narrow of a box, and I think you described it beautifully when you talked about him being transcendent in a sense. He doesn't feel the need to serve a particular box. He serves the church. He serves God, of course, and I think that that's
yeah,
that's it. So sometimes his unflinching gaze is focused on conservatives and a lot of times on liberals, but it's not about whether they're conservative or liberal. It's about how
yeah.
much they're in line with proper church teaching and tradition. I mean, which is how it should be, I think, right? But we too often, I
Hmm.
think, take those smaller boxes, even if they're good smaller boxes, right? I'm not trying to say that they're necessarily bad, but then they
Yeah,
start to replace the larger box that's much more important. I think he does a really great job of discerning about that, and challenging. Like you
absolutely.
said, he's challenging
Yeah.
to everyone. That's a great way to put it.
That's absolutely true, because I mean it's funny, because if you I grew up in traditionalist circles, and a lot of them think he's a modernist or some kind of progressive theologian, and yet for the progressives he's this arch conservative and rigid,
Very much.
right? And when I read him, I'm like, what are you guys talking about? It's just not there. And then when I read his biography, or I have his own memoirs and memoirs from his brother, the man that he truly was is not the one that he's portrayed or thought to be. And this goes for conservatives as well. I think a lot of people don't know who he is, and the process of uncovering who he really was, I think, will be a benefit for the church, because then we'll realize that we really need what he had to say. Um, but there was something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember, so I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's great. And I
Yeah.
originally, and I've kind of teetered between titles. I'm notoriously terrible about changing my titles a couple days after I release videos because I decided they can be tweaked. But regardless, at one point I had Unmasking the Real Ratzinger, as the title, and then I thought maybe it was too
Yeah.
clickbaity. But at the same time, I actually thought I might be able to defend it because I do think that in many cases he has this
Hmm.
mask on, not by his own doing necessarily, but he's sort of he's put into this picture, and I
Yeah.
think there is a sense of hidden identity, uh, at least obscured identity, or oftentimes hidden, at least until you start to take the time to read what he's written.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And yeah, so I guess just diving in, I know we've talked a lot about him, very broadly speaking, but can you give us a
Hmm.
brief overview just of his background and biography? I think specifically as it relates to his ascension to the papacy, but
Yeah.
yeah, can you just give us an overview?
Yeah, so his full name was Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger. He was born in a small Bavarian village in Germany. It's called Machtel am Inn, Machtel for short. And he was born on Holy Saturday in 1927. It was the 16th of April. And for him, that was very significant. In fact, if you don't mind, I just have a very short quote here from
Please.
Peter Seewald, who's his biographer. And Seawald says here on page 17 of the first volume, he says, the symbolism of Holy Saturday never left him, that darkest mystery of the faith, which is also the clearest sign of hope. He thought about it all through his life. On the night of Christ's descent, the unthinkable happened. Love penetrated the realm of death. Even in the deepest darkness, we can hear a voice calling us. We can reach for a hand to grasp us and lift us out. And the reason why I find that quote so beautiful is because it really, there's something providential about the day of his birth. And as we'll get into it, also the day that he died. But because we talked about him being important at this juncture in history. And this is we've gotten to the moment in history where, the death of God has been declared. and the moral landscape, to use a phrase from an atheist, has been kind of devastated.
Mm.
And so he read a lot of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir as
Hmm.
well. And Sartre's nihilism is something that he sought to really respond to. And him being born on the day of the death of God, and yet one of his most profound works is, as you know, is his book Eschatology, and in it he shows how it's precisely in death that love itself comes to give us life through communion with God in death. And there's something about that. The man who was born on the day of the death of God at a juncture in history where the horizon is godless says something to us about faith in Jesus Christ. To me, that's incredible. So I think it's very important.
I like
um,
it. I think it's a foreshadowing of his prophetic voice in the church in many ways, right? Or whether it
oh,
was meant to be or not,
absolutely.
it retroactively we can certainly describe it so.
Absolutely. No, definitely. Yeah, and so he had a brother and a sister. His sister was 5 years older than him. His brother was 3 years older than him. And they moved around a bit because his father was a policeman, and he had to move around. One time he had to move around in order to get away from the Nazis because he was fiercely anti-Nazi, and thought of Hitler as the Antichrist. But so they went from Maktil, where he was born, to Titmoning, which is a place he spent. I think it was 3 years. I think it was, let's see, yeah, about 3 years. And he was very young at the time, but he described that place as his childhood's land of dreams. And it's funny because as a kid, him and his brother and sister, there was this shop where they saw a teddy bear in the on the display, and he absolutely loved the teddy bear. He must have been how old was he? He must have been like 3, 4 years old. I'm not sure. And he absolutely loved it. And one day the teddy bear was gone, and so he was very upset about it. And they all were too. And that Christmas, the teddy bear was right there at the foot of the Christmas tree. And it turns out he had it even for his whole life, and even when he was in Rome, he had it in the Apostolic Palace, the same
Oh
teddy bear.
wow.
So, and what I find beautiful about it is that it's on his coat of arms. He had a bear that was it was from a story from the life of Saint Augustine, I think. You know what? I'm gonna have to punt on that. I can't remember the details, but it's connected to his coat of arms. Something about the taming of the bear through Christ's power, but I can't remember all the details. But there is a
Oh,
connection
that's
there that I find,
fascinating.
yeah,
Well, I won't quote
um,
you on it exactly, but I'm definitely
yeah,
curious to learn more. I'll be curious because I love bears myself. So I mean, if that was just another
yeah,
reason to love Ratzinger, then why
yeah.
not? And that does sound vaguely familiar with Augustine, but maybe you
Mhm.
just implanted that idea now in my head. So
Yeah, I'll have to look that up again. I read about it, I think, a few months ago. Anyway, but so that it's just there's so many things in his life that seem to be so providential,
mm.
And but after Titmoning, they moved to a town called Ashau. And it's funny because the cardinal at the time, who was the bishop of the area, the archbishop, I think, came to visit. Um, and Joseph was very impressed by the cardinal, and they kept asking little Joseph, like, "What are you going to be when you're older?" And he would say, "I'm going to be a cardinal." And he did. He became a cardinal. In fact, he became pope. But it's funny because his brother recounts in his own memoirs that they asked him what he wanted to do, and he said, "Well, I'd like to be a choir master."
Mm.
And he became one of the most famous German choir masters of the. I can't remember the name of the choir, but this choir of boys in Germany that's very well known. I think it's Domstrang. No, that's from that's from another book. Anyway, but so yeah, so he became a musician, and Joseph became a cardinal. So it's kind of prophetic there as well. But I don't
Amazing.
want to get too bogged down into his childhood. Let me try to skip ahead here. um, but so the war broke out eventually, right? And he before the war, he was forced to join the Hitler Youth, but it was against his will. And in fact, there was two classes in the Hitler Youth. You had the let me see if I can remember what they were called, the core Hitler Youth, and then the compulsory Hitler Youth. And
Mm.
the compulsory Hitler Youth, they didn't wear uniforms so that they could be singled out as like second class citizens. And eventually, the Hitler Youth got broken up because of the beginning of the war, and so the compulsory ones, who were usually mostly like minor seminarians, had to basically go back home. But
Mm.
during the war, he was drafted into some kind of it's called a flak, but it was some kind of manual labor for boys during the war. His brother was old enough to actually be sent out to the front, and his brother was in the thick of it, and he got wounded in his arm as well. And but then they eventually all made it back. The war was ended. And then he started his studies, and so he was by now about, I think, 19 years old, and he befriended this prefect, kind of a senior seminarian, because of the war, right? Like people were at different ages because now they were finally coming back for studies. So at one point you had like 40-year-olds with a bunch of 19-year-olds, doing theological studies. But he befriended Alfred Lappel, I think is how you'd say his name, and just learned so much through conversations with him. And he had teachers like Gottlieb Singen and Michael Schmaus, and um, there was another one, I can't remember his name, who gave him a lecture in the history of philosophy that spans all of the history of philosophy in several lectures. And he said at one point that was like one of the most formative experiences of my intellectual life. And he got steeped into the Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, and writers like Edith Stein, Max Scheler, um, as well as I already said that he read Sartre and de Beauvoir and Heidegger. But of course, he was made to translate Aquinas's treatise on love, um, and as well as he did his dissertation on Augustine, his first dissertation on the house and people of God in Saint Augustine. He did a second dissertation on the theology of divine revelation and theology of history in Saint Bonaventure. That's an interesting story in itself. Dr. Richard Decloux is much better at telling it than I am, but so he loved Augustine very much so, and Bonaventure really helped him in the area of divine revelation. So he was he was an academic. He was his
Very
vocation was intellectual, and he wrestled with let me just make sure I get this name right. I have it right here. One a very important person for him was the teacher of his friend Alfred Lappel. The teacher was Theodor Steinbucher, and he's very important because he opened him up to the personalism of Shaler and others, but also Ferdinand Ebner really kind of opened him up to a perspective of what Martin Buber calls the I-thou relationship between God and the creature. And so he was really very stunned by personalism. It really moved him deeply, and it's throughout his entire work. But also, a very formative moment was when he first read Henri de Lubac's Catholicism. That book was, you know what? I have a quote here that he says about that book,
Oh,
if I can
perfect.
find it. Here it is. Sorry. Okay. He says about de Lubac's book, he says, quote, "This book was for me a key reading event. It gave me not only a new and deeper connection with the thought of the fathers, but also a new way of looking at theology and faith as such." And that's from his memoirs, Milestones. And that's he doesn't mince his words. When Ratzinger says something, he means it. And so that book was hugely influential. And he met he met de Lubac at the council as well, and even after a few times. Um, so de Lubac was very formative, especially that book Catholicism. And after he read that, he got a hold of Corpus Mysticum, the drama of atheistic humanism, and most of de Lubac's works, Surnaturel and other things like that. So, and he also discovered von Balthasar, and
Mm.
was very impressed by Balthasar's culture, by his erudition and his education. For him, Balthasar and de Lubac were probably the most educated men he'd ever encountered. Um, but Augustine was really his master. In fact, if you don't mind me throwing quotes out, because I think these quotes are just so good. Two quotes from the first volume of Seewald's biography. Seewald says Ratzinger called Augustine a man full of passion and faith of the highest intelligence, but also his friend and my great master Augustine. And on the next page, Seewald says the Augustine scholar Cornelius Mayer thought Joseph's identification with Augustine went so deep that perhaps Ratzinger ought to be called a second reborn Augustine. And so the connection between Augustine and Ratzinger is something that actually really interests me, because you see so many similarities with Ratzinger's political ethics, his eschatology, his pneumatology, this theology of the Holy Spirit is very Augustinian. The relationship between matter and spirit shows up constantly in Ratzinger. He has a kind of Christianized Platonism like Augustine. The relationship between faith and reason is foundational for Ratzinger. He writes a lot about it. Of course, personalism. Augustine is the man of the Confessions, right? The Confessions really moved Ratzinger. And Ratzinger has kind of an apocalyptic outlook. He's kind of a cheerful pessimist, as Chesterton would say. And I think it's very fitting. We talked about that juncture, right, between the past and the present, where
Mhm.
we're at. And so, kind of like Augustine was at a juncture with the fall of the Roman Empire. And so I really think Ratzinger is, to use a very theologically incorrect phrase, he's the reincarnation of Augustine. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't mean to cut you off. I really appreciate your connecting him back to Augustine. I know that
Yeah.
my MA program at Notre Dame, the
Hmm.
leader of that, sort of the head of that, Dr. John Cavadini, he's a major
Mm.
Augustine scholar. That's his focus. He's
Yeah.
quite well known for it. And
Yeah.
Ratzinger features heavily throughout the program, in various
Yeah.
courses.
Of course. Yeah.
Eschatology, ecclesiology,
Yeah.
apologetics of love, like all of these various courses
Hmm.
feature just little bits and pieces, sometimes longer passages, but he's heavily featured throughout it. And it makes
Yeah.
more and more sense the more you frame it in terms of the Augustinian focus, because that's
Yeah.
really how our whole program is very grounded in it.
Yeah.
Whether
Yeah.
by design or just by the fact that the head of it is so focused on him. But I love it.
Yeah.
I definitely think that way, and especially coming from a Protestant background, I find Augustine
Hmm.
has always been a very friendly to my
Yes.
formerly Calvinist brain, right? I
Yeah.
mean, Augustine was quite. I mean, he actually maybe be one of the only church fathers that is readily accepted in many prominent church
Yeah.
communities. I
There
shouldn't say
really
that,
is a
but well, I shouldn't say that it's the only one that's readily accepted. I should say
yeah.
that he's one of the few that is like frequently quoted. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Yes, yeah. No, there really is an ecumenical quality to Augustine,
Mm,
and really to the church fathers. I mean, I know that doesn't, in certain cases, that's just not true. I know that, but when it comes to more serious, I wouldn't. That's a pejorative. I shouldn't put it that way. When it comes to higher church Protestants and also academics, the fathers are much more ecumenically fruitful than the scholastics,
yeah.
because by the time of the scholastics you have the ground is set for the Reformation, and all of the disputes there, and a lot of the thinkers that Ratzinger is associated with, although that's a whole conversation on its own. They found in the fathers a very fruitful, um, area for moving forward in the precisely at this juncture of history. So definitely he was, and speaking of Augustine and of the fathers and de Lubach's book Catholicism, um, Ratzinger's Eucharistic ecclesiology, basically he took de Lubach's, right, and he admits this, of course, and de Lubach surely knows it as well. Everyone knows it, and what he did is he built off of de Lubach's book Catholicism and Corpus Mysticum, and basically deepened his own vision of a Eucharistic ecclesiology that was able to actually engage other Christian confessions in a very fruitful way. And that Eucharistic ecclesiology is at the heart of the Second Vatican Council, especially Lumen Gentium, which is on the church. Um, and there's so much of what Ratzinger writes on the church and its connection to the Eucharist is just staggeringly beautiful. and and it's to me it's been the most fruitful way to evangelize to non-Catholic Christians. is to show the relationship between the church and the Eucharist. And there's something there that clicks and that comes alive, even in non-Catholics, and they feel like there's something there that they don't have.
Mm.
Um, but we'd have to get into, but that's just, it's not really the purpose of this talk. But his Eucharistic ecclesiology is very beautiful, profound, and helpful, I think.
No, I think
So.
that's a really helpful comment, and it's one that resonates with my own journey as well, because I know that a long time, maybe 10 or more years before I became Catholic, I became increasingly concerned by the lack of emphasis on the Eucharist within my
Mhm.
Protestant tradition. Long
Yeah.
before I saw Catholicism anywhere close as an option, that's probably what led me towards the High Church Anglicanism, which is where I fell in love with high church liturgy and sacramental
Hmm.
theology and those types of things. So yeah, whether I realized it or not before you said it, I think that the Eucharist was one of those initial dominoes, at least in terms of my motivations, that drove me to look
Hmm.
elsewhere from my more low church Protestant background. So that's really interesting you say that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And another thing about Ratzinger is that he wasn't so much so caught up in some of the controversies prior to the council. So he really is and I got that from, to give credit where it's due, from Dr. Richard Decloux.
Mm.
Because he wasn't caught up in some controversies like de Lubac was caught up in controversies. He's he's such a fruitful thinker for common ground amongst various factions within and without the church. What was really incredible to me is discovering, because we all have this picture of Ratzinger, the rigid conservative or the dangerous liberal, and at one point he must have changed or something, and probably 1968 during the Marxist revolts.
Hmm.
There's this narrative out there, and I'm telling you, when I read his life and started reading his works, and what I discovered was just not the case. There's a profound consistency in his thoughts. The man did not change. Sure, he evolved and I think got more wise as he thought things through more. But his vision has been very, in fact, surprisingly consistent. His
Mhm.
theological vision, but also, he debated atheists. He engaged secular leaders, politicians. He was his work on Catholic Orthodox relations is extremely fruitful, and I think is actually going to be a foundation for future work in that area. And his work with Lutherans, I mean, the Joint Declaration, I'm sure you know about that one. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and in so many areas, the Anglicans when he was Pope, Anglicanarum Cetibus, the conservatives and the traditionalists as well with Summorum Pontificum. I mean, come on, this guy is really, he had this capacity to create a space where the full breadth of reason and reason and reasonable behavior was possible,
Mm.
and to me that speaks to something greater there, a kind of holiness, a kind of lived theology. He didn't just do theology. He did it on his knees, as Balthasar would said. He prayed his theology, if that makes sense.
It
Yeah.
does. Well, I mean, we believe in an incarnational theology, right? And I think that applies very
Hmm.
much in tangible, actionable ways. And I certainly have
Hmm.
enjoyed being exposed to Balthazar as well, and finding the connections between all of these things. It just continues to highlight how well Ratzinger was able to synthesize these various streams of
Hmm.
tradition into a cohesive theology that was at once
Absolutely.
timeless and also incredibly modern and relevant. And I think perhaps
Yes.
that's why people sometimes accuse him of being on one side or the other, because perhaps
Yes.
they're in an extreme leaning camp one way or another, and
Yeah.
they don't see him fully in their camp because he's not. But it's not because he's
Yeah.
in the other camp, right? And that's where the mistake is. He's just
Yeah.
consistently, kind of down the middle, so to speak. And that's an
Absolutely.
oversimplification, but
Well,
I
and
think
it's
the
funny because,
imagery applies, right?
yeah. No, I absolutely. I mean, you got your finger on the pulse. It's absolutely true, and and because I'm always dealing with criticism of his thought. So here, one thing that came up was an accusation of him being Hegelian,
Mm.
probably from people who have never read Hegel or Ratzinger. But anyway, the point being is that, like,
Hegel's a hard
our
read, to be fair.
very, very, yeah, yes, very, very hard. But like, our tradition has out Hegeled Hegel. So that's the thing about people like Ratzinger, is that they've outdone Sartre and Hegel and people like that. And so all this idea of like, oh, he's synthesizing. It's not the truth. It's not the objective truth. He's synthesizing between extremes. No, because there's the Chalcedonian principle, which is that the person is that which can actually reconcile things and
Mm,
human nature and divine nature. And so for him, it's really his Christocentrism, which really enables him to navigate ecclesial waters and cultural waters in a way that is not just fruitful and effective, but grounded in the truth of the person of Jesus Christ, because Christ is the truth.
mm.
So it out Hegel's Hegel, and it's deeply Chalcedonian. Um, yeah.
That's a
So.
beautiful way to describe it. And the more you talk about this, the more I hear echoes of his predecessor, right? Of Pope John Paul
Mhm.
II. So, as I know, and I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more about this, before becoming Pope, then Ratzinger served as the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith under Pope
Yeah.
John Paul II. Can you talk a little bit about this? And in particular, can you share how this experience helped shape his priorities and maybe even his papal agenda, if you can speculate a bit?
Oh yeah. Two things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is that Ratzinger is a young Bavarian boy from a Bavarian family in a small town that is deeply Catholic, and so he grew up with the piety of the simple believer. And throughout his life, his sister, for most of his life, his sister lived with him and took care of his affairs. And she was one such simple of faith, right? Not that she wasn't intelligent; she was very intelligent, and she actually copied most of his stuff on the typewriter. But she wasn't a theologian, right? She was just a simple, woman at the service of her brother, and you don't see that quite often. And so he really had a place in his heart for the simple of faith. And when the smart academics, right, get full of themselves and try to tell the simple believer that what they believe is a bunch of nonsense, he would have nothing to do with that. And here his humility shines through, that it's not, faith is not just the erudition of what I can come up with. It really is the priority of the Word of God and of the simple faith of the simple believer. And for him, it's in fact because of this humility that his theology, I think, gained, again, as Dr. Leclue said, a richer depth, a deeper wisdom, and it's so brilliant and yet so simple, right? And there's something to that is just, you can't really capture it. it's a And so in fact, when I catechize at my parish, I use him because I'm able to convey the depth and the beauty of the faith while keeping it simple, you know. And you can't necessarily do that with Thomas, however important Thomas is, right? Thomas Aquinas. But Ratzinger can do that, and also Ratzinger is aware of the language of modern man, and he's aware of its pitfalls, but also of how to translate it properly, right, for the Christian. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And he serves
so
as a great bridge as a result of that, right? He's a great bridge
mhm.
for modern audience members like us, even, looking back and trying to access some of Thomas Aquinas's thinking, thoughts.
Yes,
I think that
yes.
Ratzinger is really is a good bridge, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's the thing about Thomas, because when I first started reading Thomas, as everyone who first picks up the Summa, it's like, what in the world's going on here? And I was reading Father Norris Clark's book for undergraduates, but it's not that simple of a read. It's pretty challenging. It's called The One and the Many by Father Norris Clark. That was really the key to unlocking the Summa and to kind of translating the Summa in a way that kind of the coherence of Thomas's theological vision became evident. And so that's the thing. Oftentimes we require some kind of translation work. And I really think Ratzinger does that for the tradition in a way that's relevant for the church now, so that she can move forward in the right direction. And that's why I think he's going to be declared doctor of the church. It's really his fundamental theology and his synthesis of things
Mm.
that really makes him so important. Yeah.
I love that because it really speaks to his ability. Because of course he wasn't innovating, right? I mean, hopefully, needless to say, but he's not innovating
Yeah.
here. He's further explaining and diving deeper,
Yes.
helping to
Hmm.
elucidate these truths that have been revealed once and for all. And I think he does such a
Hmm.
brilliant job of being that translator for the modern mind. And it's such a beautiful thing
Absolutely. Yeah.
when you find someone like that. And he's certainly not alone, but he's in a rare group, that's for sure.
Definitely. And I want to apologize. I see you got to be careful with me because I'll go down some tangents here. But to bring it back to your
Don't
question,
apologize, man. It's great. I like it.
no, yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, the question about him being head of the CDF. Well, so the first thing is the faith of the simple believers, right? His loyalty to the simple believers made him, protective of them.
Mm.
And academics don't like that because of the pride that comes with their erudition, oftentimes. That being said, Ratzinger himself, and again, this is something Dr. Richard Leclue brought up, Ratzinger himself, his dissertation got rejected for supposedly being overly subjective, and there's a lot more that can be said about that. But so and that was very traumatic for him because he had already bought the place for his parents to live at, and suddenly he was going to be responsible for the homelessness of his family. Anyway, he found a way around it and he passed the dissertation. But um, you know, being subject to someone criticizing you and not giving you the opportunity to explain yourself is something that he experienced. And so when he was head of the CDF, and as I went through Seawald's second volume that covers a lot of this, when he told certain academics or theologians that they were going too far, he gave them ample opportunity to enter into fruitful dialogue with him and the CDF, and he was never arbitrary. I do think he got frustrated occasionally, and that might come out. I think there's one article he wrote about theologians denying the term soul, the existence of the soul, and that really frustrated him. And so he can get frustrated, but he's never been arbitrary and never wielded power in a tyrannical way. Never. It's just not like him at all. And that's funny because that's the opposite of what the media was saying. And a lot of what was behind this was Hans Kung, who was really vicious towards Ratzinger, especially manipulated the media to make him look like this horrendous, inquisitioner, which is just anything but the truth. And so Hans Kung had a chip on his shoulder because him and Ratzinger had a profound falling out, and I would argue Kung and the church had a profound falling out as well. And so I think a lot of what's behind this vision of Ratzinger is the calumny of Kung. I think, but but also his loyalty to the simple believer is going to ruffle the feathers of those who think they're smarter than everybody, So that's just the nature of it. But he was never arbitrary. He was always fair. He gave opportunity for people to work things through and work things out. And in fact, now because he's known for the liberation theology crisis in South America. Well, South America now has realized that if it weren't for Ratzinger, things would have been very bad in South America. So thanks to him, he really did stabilize a lot of things in South America by showing that liberation theology it's a kind of Marxist co-opting of the faith, and it's not gonna be fruitful. And so that's why he was disliked by the elite, so to speak, but also loved by the faithful. And that's why when he became Pope, the faithful were very happy. So that's kind of an overview of his time as head of the CDF. Oh, and he was responsible for the compilation of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You can see his hand in that, fingerprints here and there. But it was written by the whole church. It wasn't written by him. That's ridiculous, right? It was all the bishops of the whole church coming together. And so there again, you see his humility, his self-effacement, and his ability to synthesize what others bring to the table, right?
Mm.
And that's profoundly amazing to me, that his ability to brilliantly synthesize while being humble and caring for the faith of the simple. So
No, I absolutely love that. The servant of the servants of God will forever be my favorite papal title. And anytime a pope actually lives up to it,
yeah.
I mean that sincerely. I think it's a beautiful title,
Hmm.
right? The servant of the servants of God. I mean, what a beautiful thing. Because
Yeah.
if certainly the pope has many, many roles. Some of them have very regal and elevated titles, and then some of them emphasize
Yeah.
the Christ-like humility in
Yeah.
different ways. And I just really, really love that. And it seems that
Hmm.
despite perhaps a reputation to the contrary sometimes, but I think that's just complete mischaracterization. And I also think it's easy in this internet age to ascribe motivations and intentions when
Hmm.
we have no real business making those judgments over people and why they did something or why they didn't say something or whatever the case might be. My wife and I were actually talking about this relatively recently, and she was saying that she thought, I don't know, I don't want to misquote her here, but we were, maybe I'll just say this, I'll say that we were talking
Yeah.
about how we thought that perhaps even if John Paul II were Pope today in this
Yeah.
vitriolic internet age, he
Yeah.
might be almost as controversial as our current Pope Francis is, just because of the way that people take
Yeah.
things and run with it. And we've seen that somewhat anachronistically applied to
Hmm.
people like the late Pope John Paul II and Ratzinger and Pope Benedict. Kind of
Hmm.
like looking back, people absolutely
Yeah.
have started to make those judgments, even judgments that weren't actually very prevalent at that time are being
Yeah.
applied looking back. And I think that's a common thing throughout history, and it's unfortunate, to be sure.
Hmm.
So we've talked a lot about his overall approach to these things, some of the highlight reel, so to speak. What would you say
Hmm.
is his greatest contribution to Catholic theology during his time as Pope? So moving fast forwarding just a little bit now.
Yeah. Well, greatest contribution in theology is almost impossible to pin down because, again, I keep referring to Dr. Richard Decloux because he actually is a Benedict scholar. I'm not, but hopefully one day I will be. But I keep referring to him because he, as he pointed out, he basically wrote about everything in theology and even things outside of theology occasionally, but mostly theology. And that's the thing. So it's precisely because of the coherence of his vision and the foundations that he's able to, um, demonstrate or lay out and build upon, and the higher principles, applying them to specific context. Because of that, it's hard to pinpoint a particular area. However, I do have a bias, right? So, me particularly, when I read him, I have a favorite section,
Mm,
a favorite topic that he talks about, and you probably know where I'm going, but it's his it's his eschatology, because that's always been, it's one of those questions when you're a teenager. You wonder, like, what happens when you die? Like, do you
mm,
pop into eternity, like the world is already over, or like is there like a kind of, is there time after you die? But so there's all these questions, right? Where's heaven? Is it like a place? Or all these questions, and the way he treats eschatological questions is, I think, unprecedented, and also very. I have only encountered a single scholar to address it, and
mm,
that's Dr. Fletcher. I can't remember his first name, but Dr. Fletcher wrote a book called Resurrection Realism, which is about Ratzinger's theology of the resurrection. And other than Dr. Fletcher, I have yet to. Dr. Decloux's book's going to come out, and he has a chapter on eschatology. But other than him, no one's really talking about it. And I really think that Ratzinger succeeds where Desjardins can be overly biological and controversial, right? Teilhard de Chardin, and Ratzinger, I think it's precisely because of his Augustinianism that he succeeds in this area. While it's funny, there's a story of Desjardins talking to Dietrich von Hildebrand, saying something about Augustine very negative, and von Hildebrand being very put off by that. Well, you don't have to worry about that with Ratzinger, but that's a nerdy tangent. Anyway, his eschatology is really where I really like what he says, and it's he has a kind of progression. It develops his thought, his eschatological thought, but I have not encountered something like it before. So that would be that. And as Pope, his three encyclicals, right? So Deus Caritas Est, which is just this beautiful letter on love. It's just
mm.
incredible.
It is
Spe
beautiful.
Salvi, isn't it? It's just
Mm.
gorgeous. And Spe Salvi is just rife with wisdom. And it's one of
Right,
those
the hope of
juncture.
salvation, right? For those who don't know Latin, the hope of
Sorry,
salvation. Yeah.
yeah, the hope, yeah, yeah, in hope you have been saved. It's from, I mean, that's
Mm,
not
yeah.
the title, but it's from the passage from Paul, and yeah, that one is speaking of of historical junctures. Space salvy is very important, especially because at the juncture we're in, there's a kind of despair, nihilism, and depression that Space salvy would be a good read to give us a better perspective. And then Deus Caritas Est, which is also quite beautiful, but gets into some social matters. And finally, people don't know this, but Pope Francis's first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, was mostly written by him. In fact, I've been reading Ratzinger for a while now, and so I read Lumen Fide recently, and I think I could tell where it was Francis and where it was Benedict. And you know, this is not authoritative, don't quote me, but I want to say 90% of the encyclical is Benedict. And so probably reworked a little bit, but towards the end it felt more like Pope Francis. Anyway, so that's another one that's important because it's on the theological virtue of faith. So he writes about love, he writes about hope, and he writes about faith. And as Pope, he's and if I'm going on a tangent, cut me off, but as Pope, he you know, his Wednesday audiences, his catechesis was very important because he goes back to the apostles, to the New Testament, to St. Paul. He has a whole series on St. Paul, to the church fathers, to great saints. He wants to root us back into the faith. He wants to renew the faith because he realizes that, you know, whatever we might do, you know, actively speaking in the church, we have to realize that that's kind of pointless. It's not pointless, but it's kind of pointless because the real problem is the faith, and there's a crisis of faith. And until we address that, whatever we do misses the point. And so he wouldn't he would want us to stop being so busy, you know, busybodies and bureaucratic systems and stuff like that. He would want us to deepen our faith and to renew our interior life. So those are just a few things I could go on about his pontificate, but I'll leave it at that unless you have more questions.
I think that's a great overview, and I just want to correct myself that saved by hope or saved in hope is actually what it is. I was thinking space, not
And-
space. So
oh,
apologies
you're good.
anyone to the one or two people in the world who know Latin well enough to correct me on that. I apologize out there. So, but hey, with as being a Catholic, it's a much easier thing to get called out on. So I just wanted to go on record
Yeah.
and correct myself. But no, that's perfect, and I really do love the tie-in and the focus on the cardinal virtues. To be honest with you, I'm not
Mhm.
sure that I ever realized that, even though it's quite overt, isn't it? I've read all
Yeah.
three of those, but I don't know that
Mhm.
I don't know that I ever looked at them all three side by side in order to make that comparison, which is really interesting, and I think it's
Yeah.
quite beautiful, because it
Yeah.
goes back to what we've already been talking about, right? We've talked about a lot really tonight. We've talked about his being a staunch defender of Orthodox doctrine in times of changing culture. I think that's been a recurring theme throughout this
Mhm.
conversation. So maybe dovetailing off of that, how did he navigate those tensions between tradition and modernity? So we've talked a lot about how he's been mischaracterized, and we've talked a little bit about
Yeah.
this, but if you had to summarize his approach to those types of things, how would you describe that?
That's a difficult question. I'm going to give my best shot at it. So, you know, he wasn't tied to any particular system of thought. And he realized one thing, which is that in the ancient world, in the patristic era, and the Middle Ages, you had a common philosophy, or at least common philosophical assumptions, a kind of realism that was taken for granted. And so philosophy was, it became very easy to give philosophy its place as the handmaid of theology. But precisely in our postmodern world, where the kind of realism of philosophy has kind of crumbled, he realizes that there's a certain crisis of reason in his relationship to faith. And so it's not good enough to just go back and resurrect, you know, a certain philosophical language of the past, precisely because of this new, very real situation, um, that we no longer have that kind of common philosophical ground. And so really, it's hard to say how he marries the past with the future in the present, but I would say he gives priority to the biblical word. That's where he goes. He says the language of scripture is, you cannot do away with that. It's language that has been given to us. It's not something that's a product of our own thinking. So the priority of scripture and of the God who speaks in our encountering him, and then the reasonableness of scripture, so reason following from that faith, so you know, a thinking through of what has come before us. And so he would basically want to reestablish a relationship between faith and reason, um, in a more existential stance towards the future, where we actually explain the reason for our hope, as Peter says, right? And so, but he doesn't subscribe to one particular philosophical system. Um, but of course, he obviously realizes that you cannot dispense with metaphysics, and ontology. And but this is kind of nerdy talk. It's a hard question you asked me, but so in other words, I think he's engaged in his own synthesis of the philosophical realism of the past in a way where he can explain it to postmodern people, right? And he does this in a way that actually is grounded in the biblical word of the God who speaks to us before we think up anything. So I don't know if that really answers your question. He is a bit original. His theology is definitely unique. It's he's not, you can't really put him in a school of thought. He's a kind of idiosyncratic in that way.
I actually
Uh,
really like that because I think, in some sense, being where we are in history with the luxury of having 2 millennia of church tradition to look back
mhm.
on and to lean on in our own thought, in some sense, I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice if we overly focus only on one stream of thought at this point. Maybe that's controversial
Mhm.
in itself, but I don't think it necessarily should be. I'm not saying that we can't have favorites. I'm not saying don't lean more
Yeah.
on one than another, right? I mean, we all have our natural
Mhm.
inclinations. But I do think that there's something to be said, right? If you're someone who's drawn to Thomistic thought, I mean, dive
Mhm.
into Augustine, right? I mean, don't rob
Yeah.
yourself of that just because you prefer Aquinas. And I think that, as
Mhm.
someone who is not an expert in either, but has studied both to an extent, I see both Augustinian, I know we talked about that a lot, but also Thomistic, categories are prevalent
Mhm.
throughout Ratzinger, right? Or at least that baseline understanding, right? Because Thomas Aquinas was
Well,
a doctor of the church. I mean, so of course, like, he
yeah.
has some of this common framework, some of this common language, but he approaches
Mhm.
it from a very different perspective. I'm not trying to say that he's overly Thomistic. I'm just saying you
Yeah.
can see whispers of all of the major figures, in a sense, right? Going back to that synthesis point.
Absolutely. I mean, he definitely wants Thomas. He may not want, a form of neo-scholasticism that he just wasn't comfortable with, but he definitely wants Thomas, and he wants the fathers, and he wants the scholastics. He
Mhm.
definitely doesn't want to get rid of the past. He wants to take it and to bring it back to the present and say these guys have things to say that are relevant to us today. To me, it's more of the philosophical question, which is a little more complicated, I think. But yeah, but all these great thinkers of the past, because philosophy and theology, we think of them as like radically separate things, and that's a whole debate as well in theology. But it wasn't so simple back then, so I'll leave that at that and not ruffle any feathers.
No, I think
Yeah,
that's a great introduction, right? And we can certainly
yeah,
circle back to this perhaps in another follow up video if we want to dive deeper into one of these points. But I think this is great, right? To give someone an
mhm,
overview
yeah,
of who he was, why he's important, and what were his major contributions. So I think this is great and exactly what we were hoping for. Um,
definitely.
Leaning further into this line of thinking, can you speak a little bit to how Pope Benedict handled various crises during his papacy, as well as the various scandals that occurred? And in particular, I'm interested in discussing his leadership style during these times of crisis. How did he
Mhm,
approach it? How did he
yeah.
handle himself? Yeah, can you speak to that? And also, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what was going on?
Yeah, well, so one thing about Pope Benedict or Ratzinger is that he's a very meek and humble man who never really sought out any kind of leadership. In fact, he much preferred to be able to go somewhere and just read books and write books, and he didn't want to become a bishop. He didn't want to become a cardinal. He didn't want to be working in Rome at the CDF, and he definitely didn't want to be pope. He didn't want any of those things, so that's important to keep in mind. But when they were thrust upon him, he accepted them in humility and realized that despite his weakness, the Lord would strengthen him. Um, there is something to say because of his temperament. He wasn't always the best administrator. He's much more of a theologian. He's not really, he's not good. He was okay, but he wasn't the best at um, just administration, politics, management. He had to rely on his friends for that. There's several crises in the Catholic Church, but of course the big one that people will bring up is the sex abuse crisis. And I think so. During the reign of John Paul II, because John Paul II came out of Poland when it was occupied by the communist regime, a very frequent tactic that was very pervasive in Poland at that time was to accuse many priests of sexual misconduct in a way that was politically weaponized in order to attack the Catholic Church from the communist regime and the KGB and stuff like that. And so John Paul II was just naturally skeptical, when it comes to accusations like that. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't do things to discipline priests. He did quite a bit. But it does mean that occasionally, I think we could say he kind of missed the mark. But here's the thing: when Ratzinger became head of the CDF, he started cleaning house and defrocked a whole slew of priests. I think the most defrocked priest in in the history of the church. I mean, don't quote me on that, but I mean, like, 'cause we don't really know. Because I remember reading some passages in like an
Yeah,
old
great
council where
quote.
they, yeah, where they defrocked some priests, but like, the fact that we have the media now, we know everything that's going on. But Benedict really cleaned house, and he also changed the policies. Basically zero tolerance policy, and it was a lot stricter and tighter. Um, and when he was pope, he didn't stop doing that. And, he tried to simplify things. The bank problem in the Vatican, he tried to undo that, and was mostly successful. But then Benedict also, because of precisely that thing I mentioned of his managerial sometimes missteps, did things slip through the cracks? I would say so, yes, but it's mostly because of the bureaucratic complications that happened. That being said, he definitely was in recent time the most effective cardinal and pope to discipline priests. So it's very much so a caricature out there that he was just this enabling, monster. That's just not the case whatsoever.
I think it's really interesting because I think a lot of times people fail to fully consider how large the Catholic Church is as an
Hmm.
organizational body and the
Yeah,
necessary difficulties there are in managing and administering that type of an organization, right? There's certainly the theological side of
yeah,
things, right? When doctrines are being defined and expounded upon, and those types of
hmm,
situations, we of course believe in the prerogative of infallibility, but it doesn't
yeah,
apply to matters of administration and this sort of
yeah.
tedious. If only, right? If only it did.
I
But I say this
wish.
because I
Yeah,
have a lot of Protestant viewers as well. So I want to just say
I
that
see. Yeah,
for those Protestants who might be listening to this, this is not a surprise to us. It is certainly an unfortunate thing. It is an unfortunate
yeah,
reality, but it's not a surprise necessarily in terms of what we believe that the leadership should be. And of course, yeah, and also I
mhm,
think just it's unfair sometimes to think that one man could have the type of visibility that he's often accused of. And I think this applies to any pope, right? Any pope that you want to put in your crosshairs, you could probably apply that statement to.
And can I just say, Noah,
Yeah,
because this is
please.
important, because Benedict, like, he had to. I think he did the most that a pope had done so far, and like you said, the bureaucracy and the sheer size of the church, right? But he also had to deal with the Jewish question as a German pope, right, after World War II. So you have the victims of sex abuse, the Jewish people, and other religious or organizations and other religions, and he had to talk to all these different people and be diplomatic, basically. And another thing that he's known for is having done the most when it comes to ameliorating the relationships between the Catholic Church and Israel.
Mm.
um and he's the second German pope to sit on the chair of Peter. And so so yeah, the sex abuse crisis, you had to deal with that, and then the Jewish question, you had to deal with that. And so all I'm saying is that, like, you can only expect so much from someone in large of such a huge organization. I think he did a pretty good job.
I
Yeah,
think did a much better job. I know he did a better job than I would have been able to do. I think I can at least say that. It's something that I just like to remind
yeah,
myself of sometimes, right? It's easy to sit here and judge someone, but the reality is, in the Catholic Church
mhm,
as well as in all large organizations, there are some similarities, right? There are some shared
yeah,
institutional similarities, and one of those similarities
mhm,
is that he has a team of advisors, right? And he, in some sense,
yeah,
you know,
Has to rely on them.
has to rely on them by necessity, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
There's a necessity to delegation and to leaning on advisors. And I think that's true for all leaders. But it's important to remember, I think, and it's important for those who aren't as familiar, and especially for those who aren't Catholics, who might look back on it
Mhm.
more friendly manner. I think to frame it in that sense, right, that it is still one man at the head of a incredibly large organization with limited visibility due to his
Yeah.
being human, right? So, no,
Yeah.
that was really helpful. I think that's a paints a really great picture of it. I have a couple more questions before we dive into a Q&A period, although I haven't gotten any
Sure.
questions. I haven't been monitoring it, but to anyone listening, if you do have questions about what we're talking about, please do add them in the comments. We'll probably shift over there in a few minutes, but I do want to ask, I think maybe it's inevitable that I have to ask about this. Why did Pope
Mhm.
Benedict make the unusual decision to resign the papacy? And what does that, reveal about him with respect to his legacy and what we've been talking about?
Yeah. Well, one thing it did is that it surprised the conservatives, as he tends to do, and he's always surprising everybody because he doesn't fit to people's boxes. But um, the reason why he did it, I think, we can only know, right? I mean, he explained that his strength had failed him, and so
Mm,
he had to step down because he could no longer bear the responsibilities of the Petrine See. So that's the reason he gives us, and obviously we should take him at his word.
of
Now,
course.
but why, in light of John Paul II, the way he, his capacity also became, he became incapable of bearing those responsibilities, and yet, he stayed in on the chair. I think many factors. The fact that he's been wanting to it reminds me of another monk that was made pope against his will, and he just wanted to go back to the hermitage, right? So Ratzinger always wanted to go back home. He tried to resign 3 different times when head of the CDF, and was refused 3 different times by Pope John Paul II. In fact, Pope John Paul II appointed him dean of the College of Cardinals. And when Pope John Paul II died, he gave that speech, which is incredible, on the dictatorship of relativism, which was, not a pleasant speech. It was kind of a doom and gloom speech. And then guess what? The Cardinals elect him. So he really didn't want to be elected. That being said, he didn't flee from his responsibilities. I think he saw that there is someone younger than me who can serve the church in a way that the church needs, and I cannot right now. And so I need the church more than the church needs me. And so really, it's his humility. It's really his profound humility and his understanding of that the bishopric, and in this case, the bishopric of Rome, which the papacy itself, is really it's a job of shepherding. And it's a job of paternal presence, and he said that, I maintain that aspect of paternal presence to the church, kind of like a bishop emeritus. Well, here it was a pope emeritus. So there is precedence, because the papacy isn't some kind of other sacrament, right? It's not some kind of extra bishopness, right? It's a bishopric as well. And
Hmm.
so theologically, it's consistent. And really, I really think at the end of the day, it was his humility. But the last thing I would say about his resignation is that I think not only is it humility, but it's also an example. It's a lesson, because I think that he was very weary of the idea of implementing a program to fix things,
Mm,
because we are at that juncture, as we spoke of over and over today, of a crisis of culture, a crisis of meaning, as some people call it. And what's the solution? Well, it's not to implement some kind of human program, but really it's to get out of God's way and to renew and to deepen our faith. And so to me, I think that not only was it his humility, but it was him leading by example, of saying, as whether I'm pope or not, or whether, this or that implementation takes place or not, ultimately God's going to be the one to renew the church, not our human efforts. And so he stepped out of the way because he realized that God would, and he needed God too. He was at the end of his life. He thought he was going to die very soon.
hmm.
It turns out that when he stepped out of the chair, his the all that burden being off of his shoulders, his health got better, and he ended up living a decade. But he thought he was going to die very soon. He was very overburdened. So yeah, so that's what I would say about his resignation. Now, last thing, I keep saying last thing, but people were upset. Like they say, I feel abandoned, and again, I think that's another example of that feeling and that sense of entitlement. we're not entitled to Pope Benedict as our spiritual father. We have been gifted him as a spiritual father, and people who were saying that ought not to have said that, and they were wrong. So, yeah,
No, I think that's great, and I love that you tied it back to the humility, right? Because we talked early
yeah,
on about the importance of removing ego from the equation. I think throughout this, we've talked about
that's
how
the
he was a
priesthood. Yeah,
right,
hmm
absolutely, and we've talked throughout how
yeah,
he is so much focused more on theological truth and protection and preservation of the church in many
mhm.
ways than he was on. I don't know some of the other. I don't know what the word is exactly, but some of the other more
Pragmatic solutions.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, exactly. And then at the same time, in his humility, I do find that there is a great deal of practicality, of pragmatism, at least in his
mhm.
theology, right? And in his decision perhaps to resign. I mean, I think that was a very
I think
practical,
so.
both
It's the
humble.
pragmatism of God and not of man. Yeah.
Yeah, no, very much. So I just think it's a really interesting, well balanced sketch of a man who is known for
Yeah.
being this deep intellectual, right? Profoundly intelligent, deep thinking, somewhat, inaccessible perhaps to someone, or at least perceived as such by someone who doesn't actually take the time to
Yeah.
dig in. And then, yet on the other side, there's this deeply humble man who consistently put aside his ego, who consistently utilized multiple streams of tradition in order to formulate the truth
Mhm.
in a way that the modern age could actually hear it. Right? He was such a unifying figure in this way, and maybe
Yeah.
that's the summary that I'm hearing in so many ways. And I know that this is counterintuitive, especially because of some of the accusations against him. But
Mhm.
feel that his legacy, in many ways, is one of unification
It
around the
really is.
truth. Yeah.
No, that's beautifully summarized. That really encapsulates,
Mm.
everything we've been talking about. That's great. Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah. I mean, thank you. I mean, that was summarizing, all the stuff that I'm learning tonight. I mean, that's great. And I know that we've talked a lot about his legacy, and I think the impact that Pope Benedict had. But I guess if you
Mhm.
had to, and I guess I keep saying things like summarize and sum up, but I don't mean to say that you're going to be able to put it all into a summary, right? But
Yeah.
how would you respond if someone asked you how the church is stronger today because of Pope Benedict's papacy?
Yeah. Um Well, in catechesis, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, its implementation. He also wrote books to accompany the Catechism that I use for our CIA. So just catechesis, his encyclicals, his teachings, his theology. But also, I think that the treasure trove he left behind is going to become more and more important as time goes on.
Mm,
And so we have yet to see, but I do have an assurance that we will see his impact and influence, and it's going to become very apparent that we had a great thinker and a great theologian, and really, so it's going to lead to him being declared doctor of the church, basically, and that's a legacy, because a doctor of the church is one who guides the church forward at a particular moment in time because of a particular crisis, and has something to say that is particularly relevant, and that's him. And so I think we have yet to see it unfold, but yeah, so theologically, sacramentally, the self-understanding of the church, we're also going to see his words come true, that the church is going to become smaller but more intentional.
mm.
um, and that's just I think that's just the way it's going to happen, and that's when also his relevance will grow. People realize that, wow, we need to take a second look at this guy. Right now, I think a lot of church politics and media pictures of him, portraits of him, is kind of in the way, but that's going to settle because the secular world is always changing. But what he had to offer is something that doesn't change, but it's always fresh and alive. And so I think once all that nonsense settles, he's going to emerge from that as, and we're going to see him as very relevant. So
I love that, and I think to apply the principles that you just described to a particular example that you gave earlier about his efforts toward reunification of East and West, through some of his kind of continuations of the thought of John Paul II, right, who was very much known for that two lungs concept, the church needing both lungs to
mhm.
breathe. the lungs being east and west, but then also with his joint declaration on justification, which was profoundly impactful to me when I was still a Protestant. I stumbled upon that, and to find
I've
out that
met
the Catholic
several
Church.
Protestants affected by that, by the way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, because it to me, it showed that the Catholic Church was actively seeking reunification. And that actually
Hmm.
to me sets it apart from, I would argue, every other denomination. I know that I'd had to put a couple asterisks by that and defend it, and everyone's going to get mad at me.
Yeah.
But I think it does it, or at least let me say this, a more modest claim is that the Catholic Church seeks out reunification in a unique way that no other denomination does. Using that fullness of truth concept, and some Eastern Orthodox communions and certain
Hmm.
patriarchies have followed suit and done sort of similar things. But I think it's a really profound testament to the unifying strength of truth and love, right? And his
Yeah.
ability to articulate those timeless truths in a way that our modern brains can actually understand them, I think will prove the relevance that you're talking about, as because ecumenical conversations are only going to continue, right? We have the internet, we have mass communication, we have mass access to information, all of these
Hmm.
things. But clarity is harder and harder to find. I mean, confusion in any ways abounds as much as information, which is a weird irony, right? In this great information age, we actually have less clarity in many senses. But you look,
Yeah.
I guess because of that, we need to look to these prophetic figures, these prophetic voices who are able to articulate these timeless truths in a way that it actually applies to the modern situation. It's not manipulating the truth, it's applying it and articulating it in a novel way.
Yeah.
And I think he does it better than most. I mean, in the last 100 years, I don't know of anyone that I've read in the Catholic world that does it better. I think I can say that statement at least.
Definitely, and that's the thing. Like, there's people out there, Protestants, Anglicans, and agnostics, and Jewish scholars. They're all finding profit, benefit, and fruit in this man's theology, and they're not Catholic. So there's really something about his vision that really breaks out of categories and becomes, uh, it becomes fruitful for there's a genuine humanism in his thought,
Mm.
and it opens up doors that we didn't know were possible. And so, especially his Eucharistic theology, and so there's many roads here that can link up, and there's many possibilities, but we have to be careful and not too optimistic. But his theology, because there's a book written by several Protestants on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger.
Oh,
uh,
wow.
uh, uh, yeah, an evangelical appraisal, I think it's called. I have to double check the title, but there's that book. There's he dialogued with Rabbi Neusner quite a bit. He had his debate with Habermas. He's talked to atheists, agnostics, Jews, Lutherans. It's just incredible, and that's why he's relevant, and not just to the Catholic Church.
I
So.
love it. I mean, he really put it into action in powerful ways, right? Without ever
Mhm.
sacrificing his loyalty to the truth. He continually reached across borders, to the peripheries. And I know that's
Yes.
a phrase that's often used now, during Pope
Hmm.
Francis's papacy, but I think it applies in many ways to the last two popes before him as well, right? I mean, it's a
Absolutely.
series, it's a pattern, I think, that is emerging in the
Yeah.
post Vatican II church, and it's one that I'm personally quite encouraged by. To be sure, there are many areas that deserve criticism and critique, and we could go through all that.
Yeah.
But I'm an optimist, and I see a lot of good in all of this. Even while
Mhm.
acknowledging that there are bad things, and I think a lot of the good that I see does relate to the ecumenical potential. The unifying principles and the ways of articulating Catholic theology in
Mhm.
a way that is palatable to Protestant ears, to Orthodox ears, that helps clarify misconceptions, things that were thought to be disagreements, perhaps
Yeah.
weren't so far apart as we maybe thought, and as is the case with the joint declaration on justification. Even though I know that not all Lutherans have signed on to it, a lot of them did,
Right.
and other denominations did as well.
Yeah.
And I know that practically speaking, and I think I've touched on this in another live stream, but I know practically speaking, even speaking with friends and family members of mine about justification, those who still adhere to Calvinistic principles, I've found that I can make great headway in those conversations when we sit down and talk about the Bible verse. What do we mean when we talk about works?
Mhm.
What do they mean when they talk about
Yeah.
faith alone, right? I mean, just asking
Yeah.
those questions can actually make a lot of headway. What do you like? What does a Protestant mean when they say faith alone? Because chances
Yeah.
are they don't mean it in as reductive of a sense as you might think. And then kind
Hmm.
of, in contrast, the Catholics do not absolutely mean it in the sense that they think that it focuses on our works as earning our way to salvation. Of course not, right? So once you kind of get those two misconceptions out of the way, you
Yeah.
can actually start to make real headway. And I think I have, and it's not because of any greatness of my own, but just leaning on these types of figures who take great care to articulate the
Yeah.
truths while understanding the other side. Maybe that's a point that I haven't said, but we've been talking around this entire time. He's very conscientious of his audience. He's very conscientious of whom he's presenting to when he's talking about theology. And I think he
Yeah.
adjusts his articulation accordingly. And I think that's really brilliant of him, right? It's brilliant rhetoric
Absolutely.
thrown in, but I
Yeah.
mean that in the best sense of the word, not the bad rhetoric
Hmm.
that takes away from the truth,
No.
but stuff that polishes it and beautifies it.
Yeah, he's very concerned with the truth. He never compromises with the truth. In fact, he thinks that it's precisely the truth that is most ecumenical.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I love that. That's the fullness of truth concept that really hooked me, I think, when I was still a Protestant, when I started to rethink the entire equation in terms of fullness of truth and the fact that
Hmm.
various groups outside of the Catholic Church can have access to truth. It's not exclusive access to truth. That's not what the fullness of truth claim is.
Yeah.
But it is saying that there's a certain exclusivity to the access to the fullness of truth. Right now, we're getting into kind of semantic,
Hmm.
layers, but it's a really interesting thing
Yeah.
because it validated what I had organically come to see as true more in a principled sense, just about truth more broadly speaking, not just religious truth, but truth more broadly, right? The truth is the
Yeah.
truth is the truth. It can't contradict itself at the same time in the same way.
Yeah.
Um, and so that
Yeah.
reframing of church history from that Catholic vantage point of fullness of truth was really, really
And
helpful for me.
can I?
Yeah, please, of
Sorry,
course.
another tangent. Because I'll try to keep this as short as possible. But for him, he saw that uh, only the truth can bring about communion, and only in genuine communion can the truth be found. And here again emerges his Eucharistic ecclesiology, and why it's so powerful when I talk to Protestants, when I bring up his vision of a Eucharistic church. It always moves them, even if they don't agree right away. It always moves them because truth and communion cannot be severed. You can't have one without the other. And really, so much follows from that. It's incredible, and that's why it's truly ecumenical and truly not a compromise. To really embrace the full breadth of truth, and that's really what will bring full communion. Yeah,
Oh, that was a beautiful way to describe it. Yeah, ecumenical in the best sense of the word and uncompromising in the best sense of the word, and both at once.
exactly.
That's a
Yeah,
great balance and a rare balance. Um,
it is. It is.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a great takeaway I think for myself and probably for anyone else listening, right? To be able to have those two good things with tension between them and keep them both
Hmm.
in our grasp at once. Um, all right, so I think that
Yeah, there's so much more that we could say. I know we don't have time, but also like his Jesus of Nazareth series, but we don't
mhm,
have time. I just wanted to throw that one out there.
that might be worth a dedicated follow-up video just on his Jesus of Nazareth
Yes.
series, just because
Yeah.
it's so great. I know we'd already talked about doing one on eschatology. I
Yeah.
think that might
Oh
need to be
man.
our next follow-up, to be honest with you, just because I'm also
Yeah.
fairly fresh on it, having studied eschatology, and he came up fairly
Yeah.
heavily in that course. So that might have to be our next one.
Yeah.
But if we do a third, I don't know if there's interest, but I'm interested. So if the
Yeah.
audience likes it and they're enjoying it, I'm happy to keep going with it. So I
Yeah.
guess before we go to a question that has popped up, where would you send people who are wanting to learn more about Benedict the 16th? Do you have any particular biographies, writings, or resources beyond what we've mentioned? Right, we've mentioned his encyclicals, his
Yeah.
book on eschatology. We've alluded to some of those, but are there any secondary sources that you recommend for someone who wants to dive deeper?
I'm trying to think.
And you could follow up in the comments too if you want to, if that's easier. I know I put you on the
Yeah.
spot with that one. That is a pretty.
It's real.
I'm
It's
terrible with
hard.
names.
No, you're fine. It's hard to say where to start. I would start with him. Like I wouldn't start with someone writing about him.
Okay.
The issue, and I'll try to make this short, but the issue is that Ratzinger, his theology is a symphony. It's not. It's not. It's not. overly scholastic, nor is it overly poetic and spiritual theology. It's in between. It's more like the analogy of a piece of music. It's coherent, but it's very expressive, right? And so it's difficult because you can't just pick up one of his books and read part of it. That's like walking into a concert at only a couple measures and only hearing the violins. Like you miss out on how everything fits. So I would say start with his series, Jesus of Nazareth, but only if you intend to read all three, or just one, but only if you intend to read the whole thing, not just part of it. If that's too much, I would say start with this little book. I have two options here. The first one would be a book he co-wrote with Hans von Balthasar. He wrote the first part. Balthasar wrote the second part. It's called Mary, the Church at the Source. This would be very good for a Protestant if they're struggling with the Mary question. Another one would be Behold the Pierced One, and it's short and but it's profound. And when you begin the book, just be patient. Let him work on you. Just read through it and then think about it. That's what I would say. So.
No, that's great. Well, I put you on the spot, and you had multiple answers ready to go. So I love it. No, that's fantastic. And then my final question, you know what? Actually, I'm going to end on that final question. I'm going to jump to the Q&A real quick because I think it's a little bit more relevant to what we've been talking about.
Okay.
From the Q&A, what is the most valuable teaching, in your opinion, from Pope Benedict for our modern age? And I know asking for one is always a hard thing, so you can just pick your
It's
favorite.
very difficult.
We won't hold you to it being the best or anything. It can just be your favorite.
Yeah, I would say recentering ourselves on Christ. So deepening our faith in the word of Scripture and in the sacrament of the Eucharist, of the altar. Yeah.
I love that because it actually reminds me of a summarizing point that came to mind when you were talking earlier about the emphasis on the Word of God. Right, John 1 teaches us that Christ Himself is the Word made flesh. Right, so the Word of
Hmm.
God has never been reduced merely to the written Scriptures. It certainly
Hmm.
includes them. Right, don't take this the wrong
Yeah.
way, but it's never been merely that. It's actually a living and incarnate Word. The Word of God is Christ
Yes.
Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. This is a
Hmm.
really beautiful thing, right? Because that's that incarnational focus that
Hmm.
we touched on earlier, and I think that really is highlighted by what you just described as his, as his sort of dual focuses of sorts. So I think it's a beautiful way to combine those legacies.
Yeah, Christ is revelation. The Scripture is how we come to know Christ. Scripture
Right.
itself isn't revelation, but it reveals revelation in a certain sense. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, and then the sacraments, of course, are our particular way of encountering Christ, in the Eucharist and in the
Hmm.
sacraments. So there's sort of this sacramental emphasis, and then also this scriptural emphasis, and the unifying
Yeah.
aspect of them, right, is the fact that both of them are pointing us to the Word of God, which is Christ Jesus, and I think it's just a really wonderful way to kind of tie his thought together. I just love that you put those two right together in like a single sentence. That was great. So. I know we're running out of time here, and I want to wrap up in just a sec. But to finish, before I conclude, do you have any interesting insights, lesser known facts, or funny anecdotes? I mean, just pick one that have come up in your research. Like, what's a funny anecdote or interesting lesser known fact that has come up in your research about Pope Benedict, of course.
He really liked cats.
Really, that
Yeah.
is. See, that's exactly the type of thing I was looking for, but I had no idea. And it's unfortunate we're not
Yeah.
in agreement. I'm a dog guy, but oh well. I don't know. It's
I'm
okay. I like
also a
animals.
dog
I'm just
guy.
teasing. We can't be fully in
No,
line.
I'm also a dog guy. I'm not particularly fond of cats, but he really liked cats.
Oh,
He
that's
loved
interesting.
animals. Yeah.
I love that because
Um,
that's a humanizing fact that I've never heard and I never would have thought of. And I think that a lot of intellectual people are drawn to animals, especially the solitary types. And
mhm.
I think that's a common thread. And actually, a lot of saints kind of mention them or it's sort of in passing. It's funny, we think about St. Francis of Assisi,
Mhm.
of course, but it's a recurring theme in a lot of the saints' lives. And I always like that. I think
Yeah.
how we treat animals tells us a lot about a person, right? Their gentleness, their humility. I don't know. And I think that
Yeah,
speaks to the character, right?
The Grand Inquisitioner, loves cats.
I love
Yeah.
it. Well, I'm biased as an animal person, but I think that tells us a great deal about his character. We're just gonna go with that.
Oh yeah.
So I know
Yep.
you agree because you're a dog person. So
Yeah. Yep.
oh well, this is fantastic. So before we close, Dom, would you like to share any more about what you're working on? How people can follow along? What? Yeah, just tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what people should be checking out.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Noah. Yeah, so definitely the YouTube channel, the Logos Project. You can find it on YouTube. Some videos are kind of, I would say don't start with. I have a series on the Society of St. Pius X. It's kind of polemical. Maybe go more to the, theology videos. That's more interesting. But I have a blog. It's called the Ecclesia blog. It's a TheEcclesia blog, blog.com. And there I write a bunch of articles. A few are written by other friends of mine, but most of them are mine. And obviously, they feature his theology quite extensively, and many more to be published. So those two places is where I'd send people: the YouTube channel and the blog as well. So
That's fantastic. I
thank.
know we have your YouTube channel already is in the description, and I just shared the Ecclesia blog.
That's it.
Okay,
.com.
perfect.com and the comment section. And you might have to remind me about it, but I'm happy to add that to the description as well after
Sure.
the fact.
Thanks.
So, yeah, that's great. And then, of course, Dom has been producing lots of great content related to Pope Benedict. So, if you are very interested in what we're talking about, he has a couple of videos related to Pope Benedict that you can definitely
And
check
more
out.
to come too with some Ratzinger scholars. So.
And more to come. That's great. And as we
Mhm.
alluded to earlier, he and I have already discussed coming on again to my channel, and then I'll actually be joining Dom later this year on his channel to talk about my conversion story. So there's lots to look forward to. Oh, I have one really fun question that I have to ask because it's awesome. Are popes
Okay.
allowed to have pets while in office? I don't know.
Yes, they can if they want to, yeah.
That is awesome. I mean, I would hope so, right? Like, I mean, if not, like the Pope should absolutely change that rule. Like, if there's ever a time.
They're the ones that change canon law, so if they need to, they will.
That is great. Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Does that be a matter of canon law? Of course, it's not a matter of like morality. So it'd
yeah,
be a matter of canon law. That's great. Now I'm just imagining like
yeah.
all these popes with their papal dogs and papal cats and their papal
That'd be kinda
apartment.
cool. Yeah.
No doubt, a couple of them had them, right? I'm sure. I'm sure. If
I
I mean
I
Pope
don't know, it's
Benedict
a good
probably.
question.
Now I want
That'd
to
be a
know.
good
Now I
book.
want to know.
Yeah,
Yeah, if anyone's out there listening, like don't quote us on this.
yeah,
We don't know if it actually has happened, but it
yeah,
would be permissible.
yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, this is wonderful. So, Dom, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. I have a million more questions, but I could also talk your ear off all night. So,
Well,
for the
thanks for
sake,
having me on, Noah.
yeah, no, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I definitely look forward to having you on again. And with that, I will shift into just a final conclusion. So, thank you all for tuning into this episode of It's Knowable podcast featuring Dom Dalmasso of the Logos Project. Dom and I have already discussed, as I mentioned, doing a follow up to this, going further into various aspects of Pope Benedict's life. So please let us know in the comments what you would like to see focused on. Eschatology is definitely a top contender, but I am open to suggestions. So let us know. And then in addition, I know I have been talking about this a lot, but I have not one, not two, but three book giveaways coming up because I hit my 500 and 1,000 subscriber milestones in the same week, which threw me for a curveball, which was an awesome and unexpected surprise. So thank you all so much. But now I'm forced to have to actually handle and manage and administrate these giveaways. So because I am slow doing this and figuring it out, I am adding a third giveaway that was unannounced just for bearing with me. So I will be announcing that soon on my channel. And those will be, of course, not surprisingly related to theology, philosophy, or the like. And I'm actually going to give the winners options. So I'll have a couple books and then each winner can pick. So as soon as I figure out the most efficient way to do this, I will announce it. And then moving forward, I plan to continue to do these book giveaways, but I'm going to do them exclusively on my Patreon channel as my channel continues to grow. But I won't have it be a high paywall. It'll probably be like a $1 or $2 type subscription, and then everyone gets entered. So more info to come, but I wanted to kind of put that on everyone's radar. And yeah, thank you again for tuning in. Dom, thank you again for teaching us so much tonight. And hope everyone has a wonderful evening. And thanks again and take care.